The nurses of Silent Hill are some of the most iconic and unnerving monsters in horror gaming, embodying the series' exploration of fear, trauma, and psychological distress. They are unique among horror antagonists for how they reflect not only generalized fears, but also the deeply personal anxieties of each game's protagonist. Within the town of Silent Hill, supernatural forces manifest a person's deepest fears and suppressed emotions, shaping them into physical forms that mirror their subconscious. This process is most apparent in Silent Hill's disturbing hospitals, particularly Alchemilla Hospital in Old Silent Hill, which handles emergency cases, and Brookhaven Hospital in South Vale, a long-term facility for the mentally ill. These hospitals frequently serve as backdrops for the nurses' appearances, adding an unsettling realism to their horrific presence. Each iteration of the nurse embodies themes like hospitalization, insanity, and death, playing on common fears surrounding medical institutions and the loss of control they represent. The town of Silent Hill uses these spaces to turn familiar healthcare figures into grotesque, disfigured beings that haunt the player. While they share common characteristics, such as their distorted, vaguely human forms and unnatural twitching movements, the nurses' appearances vary with each protagonist. These differences highlight Silent Hill's unique way of shaping horrors around an individual's psychological state. Generally, the nurses wear uniforms evocative of real-life medical staff, yet their appearances shift to reflect each character's fears and anxieties. In the original Silent Hill from 1999, the nurses, known as puppet nurses, are among the first iterations of the iconic enemy and play a chilling role in Alchemilla Hospital, where they reflect the disturbing fusion of medical care and manipulation. These nurses, distinguishable by their blue or green cardigans, white blouses, and skirts, are hauntingly human, yet altered by Alessa Gillespie's powers. Alessa, a young girl subjected to horrific treatment and ritualistic abuse, inadvertently manifests these nurses as warped versions of the hospital staff from her memories. With their human-like but humpbacked appearance, the puppet nurses are visually unsettling, emphasizing the twisted nature of Alessa's trauma and resentment towards the hospital staff who cared for her. Controlled by parasites that also possess Sybil Bennett later in the game, the puppet nurses move with a mix of animalistic behavior and frightening intelligence, wielding scalpels as weapons. When in groups, they demonstrate strategic behavior. One puppet nurse will often restrain protagonist Harry Mason, while another attempts to stab him, adding a terrifyingly organized aspect to their attacks. This iteration of the nurses also has a male counterpart, the puppet doctors, who serve as an additional unsettling reminder of the perversion of medical care within Silent Hill. The puppet nurses embody Alessa's traumatic memories of hospitalization and forced care under the influence of the Order, a cult that kept her alive against her will. These figures, much like Lisa Garland, a sympathetic yet tragically controlled nurse, are pawns within the cult's manipulation of Alessa's life. Their appearance as puppets emphasizes their role as unwilling participants in the Order's cruel intentions, acting as both caregivers and jailers. This haunting combination of helplessness and horror marks the puppet nurses as early symbols of Silent Hill's dark themes of twisted care and control. From here, we see the nurses evolve into the ones we recognize today, both physically and symbolically, as they embody the darker facets of James Sunderland's psyche and personal suffering in the second Silent Hill game. In Silent Hill 2, the nurses transform into the Bubblehead nurses, a stark departure from the more restrained puppet nurses of the first game. These grotesque figures reflect James Sunderland's internal conflicts surrounding his deceased wife, Mary, encapsulating themes of guilt, repressed desire, and the burden of illness. Unlike their predecessors, the Bubblehead nurses don't have solid heads. Instead, they wear vinyl masks, filled with a disturbing white liquid tinged with blood, representing both Mary's physical frailty during her illness and the suffocating control James may have exerted over her final days. Their constant, jerky movements convey the sensation of suffocation, as though the nurses are desperately trying to shake free from their liquid-filled masks. The swollen, misshapen design of the nurse's head parallels Mary's own swollen appearance as she spent prolonged time in the hospital, frail and unwell. A red square often obscures the mouth of these nurses, a disturbing visual detail that carries additional meaning. According to the game's designer, Masahiro Ito, these red squares represent Mary's shrieking insanity, symbolizing her suffering and fractured mental state as she succumbed to her illness. This red square motif is later carried over into Silent Hill 3, where it appears on the mouths of the Brookhaven nurses, linking Mary's pain to Alessa's through shared themes of suffering and mental anguish. These creatures are not just physical threats, but also manifestations of James's complex, repressed emotions. In Silent Hill 3, the nurses continue to evolve, diverging from the grotesque bubblehead nurses of Silent Hill to take on a more unsettlingly human appearance. These nurses reflect Heather Mason's, the reincarnation of Alessa Gillespie, fear and hatred of hospitals linked to her traumatic past. While they share some similarities with the previous game's nurses, like a busty appearance and heavy labored breathing, they are distinguished by blood splatters around their mouths, suggesting they may have coughed up blood or been feeding on something gruesome. This blood-stained, almost cannibalistic detail hints at the violence and horror Heather associates with the medical care she endured. The Silent Hill 3 nurses are uniformly designed with black bob haircuts and wield either steel pipes or revolvers, making them especially lethal. Those armed with revolvers can deal significant damage from a distance, requiring immediate attention, while those with pipes limp toward Heather, swinging aggressively once within reach. Symbolically, these nurses represent Heather's inherited trauma and aversion to hospitals. As she is Alessa reincarnated, her memories and hatred of the institution linger, fueling the manifestation of these nurses. The red square motif seen in Silent Hill reappears on the mouths of Silent Hill 3 nurses, linking them back to Mary's shrieking insanity and, here, Alessa's mental and physical suffering. This repeated motif ties the nurses to both protagonists' psychological anguish, deepening their symbolic presence across the series. In Silent Hill Origins, the nurses evolve once again, shifting from the aggressive, blood-stained figures of Silent Hill 3 into an eerily subdued and faceless form that reflects Travis Grady's more internalized discomfort and trauma. Known as faceless nurses, these creatures have a disturbing resemblance to the bubblehead nurses, but with some critical differences. Their heads do not twitch, and they face forward with surgical gloves and fleshy, mask-like coverings that seem fused to their faces, enhancing their unsettling appearance. Travis encounters 2 distinct versions of these nurses: red flesh variants in Alchemilla Hospital and green-toned ones in Cedar Grove Sanitarium, although their behavior remains consistent. Armed with syringes and scalpels, the faceless nurses attack Travis with a clinical detachment, reinforcing the theme of institutional horror that runs throughout the series. Their disturbing surgical masks and restrained movements evoke both medical dehumanization and Travis's anxiety around intimacy and discomfort with women. This interpretation is further supported by the nurses' role as frequent victims of the Butcher, a brutal figure Travis repeatedly witnesses, eviscerating them throughout the game. These scenes reinforce the vulnerability and visceral horror Travis associates with women, amplifying his unresolved feelings. With Silent Hill Homecoming, the nurses shift from the ghostly, faceless figures of Silent Hill Origins to a more aggressive, visceral form, taking on a look reminiscent of the nurses from the Silent Hill film. This design connects Homecoming's nurses to the film's iconic, unsettling portrayal while adapting them to suit Alex Shepard's experience with trauma, institutions, and repressed fears. These nurses in Homecoming are highly reactive to sound and light, instantly drawn to Alex's flashlight and attacking with swift ferocity using long knives. Often encountered in groups, they require a strategic approach, enhancing the feeling of imminent danger. Killing a nurse for the first time rewards the player with the Alchemilla's finest achievement, a callback to the original game's hospital setting, underscoring their enduring presence across the series. Symbolically, these nurses represent Alex's conflicted feelings toward institutionalization and suppressed desires, possibly influenced by his perceptions of medical staff in military settings. Alex's diary entries reveal he viewed military nurses as highly sexualized figures meant to comfort soldiers, blending discomfort with attraction. A disturbing detail unique to Homecoming's nurses is the outline of a fetus visible within their abdomens when exposed to certain lighting, hinting at themes of rebirth and complex family trauma, particularly his relationship with his brother. In Silent Hill Downpour, the nurses make only a brief cameo in the whimsical surprise ending, where they attend a birthday party for the protagonist, Murphy Pendleton. Here, they appear alongside characters from across the Silent Hill series, like James, Mary, and Heather, adopting their familiar bubblehead nurse look from Silent Hill 2. This light-hearted scene contrasts with their usual haunting role, serving as a nostalgic nod to the iconic nurses rather than a manifestation of Murphy's psyche. The nurses were even present in the spin-offs. In Silent Hill the arcade, nurses resemble those from Silent Hill 3, but feature fully bandaged faces and shoulder-length hair. Armed with steel pipes or pistols, they move with odd, bounding strides and increase in aggression after players defeat Pyramid Head, heightening their threat as they roam Brookhaven Hospital. In Silent Hill Book of Memories, bubblehead nurses appear, styled similarly to the film versions, with revealing blouses and distorted faces. As one of the most common enemies in this spin-off, they lack the symbolic depth of mainline games, but retain the classic nurse horror aesthetic. And that brings us to the unsettling reality behind the nurses of Silent Hill. As we've seen, each iteration serves as a mirror to the protagonist's darkest fears and unresolved traumas, transforming healthcare symbols into vessels of psychological horror. These nurses are more than just enemies. They're deeply symbolic representations of the character's anxieties, shaped by the supernatural forces of Silent Hill. By embodying personal and universal fears, the nurses remain one of the series' most haunting, enduring symbols of twisted care and suppressed suffering.